That's what they want me to paint? Yeah, I'll do that. Hey guys, welcome back to Black Magic Craft. This video is sponsored by Wicked Foundations. They are in the middle of a Kickstarter for a range of truly gruesome and horrific miniatures for D&D 5e. Well, I guess you could use them for anything, but they're marketing them for 5e. They approached me with an idea I couldn't say no to. They wanted me to paint one of their Dional beast miniatures, and this thing is just super cool, so I'm doing it. I am by no means an expert miniature painter, so I'm not gonna just be painting this thing. I actually decided to compensate for my lack of painting abilities by constructing a really cool removable diorama base, which of course you could take these principles and apply it to any miniature you'd like. I think it really does this miniature justice. The Kickstarter that they're running is all about creepy monsters. Really big, creepy monsters. Some of them are huge. And this is not for downloadable STL files for you to print yourself. These are intended to be physical miniatures, injection molded plastic, the real deal. And they, like I said, are designed for 5e, and part of that campaign is actually this little monster manual that they've created with stat blocks and lore for all of the miniatures. I will, of course, put links in the video description below to the Kickstarter so you can check it out in detail for yourselves. But now, let's talk about how I put this thing together. The first thing I did with this model after swooning over its coolness was prime it. I knew I wanted to paint this thing using some Citadel contrast paint because, again, I'm not an amazing mini painter, and I figured contrast paints would help me with some of the more difficult aspects of this model, like the black hair. So I primed it with this Citadel Wraith Bone primer that they recommend for the contrast paints, and it did a very nice job. It applied nicely and it dried very quickly, but my God, this is the most disgusting, foul smelling primer I've ever used. It's like they bottled burnt hair, farts, and toxic waste, but did a nice job. Before getting to paint though, I worked on constructing the removable base. I wanted like a big rock for this thing to be perched on. In my head, I was picturing something like the rock in The Lion King, but more creepy and evil. I grabbed a piece of thick XPS foam and used my handheld HOTWIRE cutter to start carving in layers of stone. I had to be careful to leave enough area on the top to surround the actual model base. I attached the foam to some medium weight chipboard to give it a more durable bottom. MDF would definitely be a better material for this, but you just can't beat the speed and ease of use of chipboard. Now here's where my first screw up happened. I planned on using SCULPTAMOLD to cover the foam to give it more strength and a more realistic stone texture. I got out my bag of SCULPTAMOLD and some cups to mix it in. When I grabbed the cups, I noticed one already had some in it. I was guessing it was left over from last time. Cool, I thought, and started mixing. I decided to test out mixing in some black paint to see how it reacted. Covered my piece and something didn't seem right. It wasn't applying or acting the way it should. It was just really creamy, but I didn't give it any more thought. Not until it was drying did I realize what was actually going on. It wasn't SCULPTAMOLD in the cup that I had found. It was quickset drywall joint compound. This is basically only one part of the SCULPTAMOLD, missing the paper fibers that give SCULPTAMOLD its strength. This really wouldn't work as well as the SCULPTAMOLD like I planned. My God, I am saying SCULPTAMOLD a lot. I decided that I really needed to go forward with my original plan, so I actually just mixed up some real SCULPTAMOLD and covered the joint compound. And I wasn't sure how these two materials would react because the joint compound wasn't fully cured, but I decided to say, screw it, and hope for the best. With the SCULPTAMOLD in place, I created a recess of the mini base to fit into. I really wanted the two pieces to blend together as best as I could get them. It was a little tricky doing this with the wet product, as taking it out just pulled the SCULPTAMOLD and distorted the edge. So I took another risk and let it dry in place with the hopes that I could later remove the model without issue. The great thing about SCULPTAMOLD is that once it's mostly dry, but not fully dry, you can easily tool it to look like stone. The trick is really not waiting until it's fully cured. I coated my base with my usual black paint and Mod Podge mixture. This over the SCULPTAMOLD makes the foam way harder and more durable than you'd expect. While that dried, I set to work actually painting the model, the part of the project I was nervous about. Not only am I not that great of a mini painter, in all honesty, I only paint a mini or two a month at best. I got hundreds of minis sitting waiting to be painted. I also wanted to do the paint job in a way that was true to the source art, which meant doing some things that were beyond my comfort and skill level, like trying to paint the horse body a very light gray with shadowy black areas and darker legs and hand. Yeah, this thing has legs and hands. Super creepy. Relying on the so-called magic of contrast paint, I attacked it with the black. First painting the legs with the stuff straight out of the bottle, then doing the body with a diluted mix that I cut with contrast medium. This worked pretty okay. The black contrast paint worked very well for the hair, however, creating a look of hair that was believably black but still retained highlights and definition. I painted the flower petals using some diluted red contrast paint and also carried some of that onto the legs. In the source art, the legs looked black, but it appeared that they may actually be red and just shadowed in the art, so I was hoping to retain some of that sort of look. For the skull, I used the red contrast paint right out of the pot, and this created a really vibrant, deep red look. Here's where my painting skills started to fall short. The contrast paint did an okay job on the body, but still looked rather messy, so I needed to highlight with a lighter gray. But this is really easier said than done, and I always struggled with doing this on big, smooth, muscular areas of bodies. My combination of lower skill and impatience usually result in a pretty chalky look when I do this. I played around and got it as good as I could, or at least as good as I could in the time I could handle spending on it. Listen, I'm just not the type of person that can spend hours and hours painting one part of a model, blending it perfectly. I just want to get in and get it done. The petals were also looking too red as compared to the concept art, so I attempted to lighten them up and make them more pink. Not only would this make it match the art better, but it would also create a nice contrast to the blood red skull. Again, my blending skills struggled here, but I was able to get them to a point that I was a lot more happy with than the body. I also didn't like how the transition of the dark legs to the light body was looking, so I decided to paint in some thin tendril-like lines to create a creepy transition, and I actually think this came out looking pretty cool. But before painting out the model base, I had to finish up the diorama one so that they could be painted in tandem. I didn't think the stone was interesting enough on its own. I wanted to cover it in remains from this thing's previous kills. I grabbed a bunch of stuff where I could grab skulls and bones from. I even utilized some tiny skeletons from a super secret project. This is something I have going on in the background slowly that I can't really talk about yet. Sorry. But the Citadel skull box and some of the leftovers from my Frostgrave cultists really got put to good use here. This part was actually really important. The thing about the models from this Kickstarter is that most of them are big, like really, really big. Some are more than double the size of this one. And the creators are aware of this and even have a size graph on the page. They are meant to be big monsters and the stat blocks reflect that. But the one thing that's kind of strange is that this model has skeletal remains underneath it, and they're the same size and scale as the beast itself. Definitely a lot bigger than a 28mm humanoid. So I decided that the reason for that is that these creatures are territorial and maybe cannibalistic, and these are actually the remains of another Dional beast. At least that's what I'm telling myself. So I figured putting on some more appropriate size 28mm skulls and bones onto the base would kind of make the whole thing make more sense and be more cohesive with other minis. Using super glue and sand, I decorated the steps of this base with the creature's previous kills. This right here is my favorite part of miniature painting. Honestly, I don't really care that much about painting minis, nor do I enjoy it that much. It's just something I need to get done half the time. But what I really love is decorating the bases. That's my jam. I primed out the big base to match the small one and decided to get a stone effect with black and brown washes over the light primer, rather than building up layers of lighter and lighter dry brushing. This effect can look a lot more natural when it works, and is honestly super easy to do. Blending the black and brown washes gives a lot of variation to the tone. One important detail is that I did some of this with the mini in place on the base so that any color streaks carried between the two of them in order to make them look like they were actually from the same piece of rock. Normally, I would just seal a mini with satin or matte varnish, but in this case, I wanted there to be a few different gloss levels to the different parts. I sprayed everything out with a matte varnish, but then used satin for the flower petals and the body to give them a tiny bit of sheen. Then I used a fully gloss varnish on the skull to really make it stand out and look more wet and slimy. I also created a bit of blood effect by mixing Vallejo water texture with some of the red contrast paint. You can do this with any acrylic paint or ink, but I used the contrast paint as it would match what I had already painted on the model. One fun thing is that you can paint streaks of this stuff on plastic, let it dry, and then peel it off and glue it to the model to create realistic looking drips of blood. So what can I say? I love this model. I love the whole line of models these guys have created. Their creepy aesthetic is right up my alley. This is the type of stuff I naturally make for my own homebrew world. I'm always gonna prefer some creepy skullflower centaur thing over an orc or a goblin. If you're the same way, well, I really encourage you to check out the Kickstarter they got going because it is full of creepy miniatures. Again, I will put the link to the Kickstarter in the description below. I really hope this one funds, as I love seeing companies doing unique lines of minis and creating actual physical miniatures for the market, not just downloadable files for those who have 3D printers. I really hope you found this video enjoyable and informative. Even if you're not interested in the Kickstarter, I'm hoping you get some inspiration and learn something about making custom diorama bases for your models. If you want to grab any tools or supplies for your own hobbying, head over to blackmagiccraft.ca. There I have my essential equipment page where I list all of the stuff, or most of the stuff, that I use regularly. I explain what it is and why I use it, and I give you links to the product so you can get the right thing for yourself. And if you really like my videos and get a lot of value out of them, one way that you can help ensure that I'm able to keep making them is by supporting Blackmagic Craft on Patreon. It's because of the support there that I'm able to dedicate all my time to such a kind of ridiculous venture of making this stuff on YouTube. I would love to have your support, and doing so gives you some access to some kind of fun rewards, like my private Facebook group and Discord server where you can ask me questions, get help from me, and other really cool like-minded crafters. That's it for this week, guys. See you again next week. Cheers.